In this week's video, we'll be painting a simple sketch. It's a super easy one to paint, kind of has a look of a graphite drawing. A little warm-up painting like this is always great to do because it only takes about 20 minutes or so to finish. You get to practice some of that airbrush trigger control, and most importantly, it's fun to paint. And one thing that I want to say before we get started is that a sketch like this is very different from the style that I normally paint on this channel, but there's countless ways to draw or paint a picture. For me personally, I paint these for myself. I just kind of do it to relax, loosen up a little bit before moving on to the harder stuff. I'm using Schmincke Aerocolors Black for this one, and I'm over-reducing this paint. It's about 1 part paint to 2 to 3 parts of water, and I could do this because I'm painting this one on hot-pressed watercolor paper with no gesso on it. It's a very absorbent surface, it's amazing for watercolors, but it's also great for airbrush sketching like this, where erasing or removing that paint isn't a priority. Like always, I'm going to include my completed sketch up on the left side of the screen so you can see what we're working towards. And if you want to copy this one for yourself, here's a high-resolution photo of my completed painting up on the screen now. It's a personal preference, but I usually like to start by painting in the eye. So this one, I started out freehand, but I realized I wanted to sharpen up the edges just a bit more. So I'm using a circle template. I move it around to find a circle that fits this eye close enough, and then as I'm spraying this in, you'll notice that I'm just spraying on the lower right-hand side of it. I sprayed a light amount of paint there so that edge is not too defined, and then along the top, I'm going to spray in some of this freehand to start out. That's going to give me a softer edge up there. I painted around the specular highlight, but to brighten it up a little bit, I'm going to use an aggressive eraser here. And remember that this is an absorbent surface here, so the erasability is not so great, but if I make a light pass with the eraser, I could just lighten the paint up a little bit. I'll switch back over to my airbrush and start mapping in the placement of a few of these darker feathers along the right side of that eye. I'm spraying it around 15 psi here with this over-reduced paint, and you can see that it gives us a very soft edge, and that's fine for now because we could sharpen it up later as we get darker with more layers of paint. As I move along to the beak, I want a sharp edge without much overspray getting in the background, so I'm using a freehand shield to help me out here. Once I spray over that, I'll switch to the airbrush freehand to paint in the right side, and then I'll start adding a gradient using that shield again just to prevent overspray from getting in the background. For the gap in the middle, the edges are a bit softer, so I'm just going to paint this in freehand, and you can see that I hold the airbrush very close to the surface to do this. I don't want to go too dark with this paint, so that over-reduction is definitely going to help, as well as trigger control. I'm just not spraying too much. For the top part of the beak, I'll do the same thing. I'll just use a shield that fits it close enough, and I apologize for the hand blocking the shot. And I just spray a very light amount of paint so we get a bit of a gradient here, a transition of value, darker on top, lighter as it moves down. For the majority of this painting, I'm going to be using the airbrush freehand, but there are a few spots like the beak and the eye that need to be sharper, so that's where I'm going to use some shields to help me out. Not only do shields give a sharp edge when you spray over them, but they also protect other parts of the painting from overspray, which is very important. You'll see that as I add in some value freehand, there's going to be some overspray in the background, so I can also clean that up with an eraser like I'm doing here. Around the eye, I'm going to move the airbrush closer to the surface and spray in these small little lines, kind of like little squiggles. And not only does that darken up the value, but it also adds some subtle texture in there, kind of like sketching with a pencil. So the distance between my airbrush and the paper is very important. When I want some softer, smoother lines, I'm holding the airbrush a little bit farther back and just not pulling too far back on the trigger. And when I want the lines a little bit darker and more defined, I move the airbrush closer to the surface and spray a bit more paint. When I'm painting a sketch like this, I tend to move the airbrush around pretty quickly so that I get some irregular and some random patterns within that texture. One thing that I like to do, and you'll see it here, is that I'm kind of like jiggling the airbrush in some points so that the thin line that I'm spraying is always moving. It's not only adding that random texture that I just mentioned, but it's also not getting too dark in one place. And that's very important for me, spraying lightly at first until I'm confident that those values and textures are in the correct places. Once they are, then I can start adding more paint. So for example, if we look at the chin here, there's some feathers right underneath the beak. I'm holding down on the trigger the entire time so the airbrush is always spraying air, and what I'm doing is painting in a few strokes almost parallel to each other. I'll allow a few of them to overlap so that it looks a bit more random in this area, but you can see how I'm spraying these in just very lightly at first. And I just control the flow of that paint by rocking the trigger back and forth. The airbrush is always spraying air because I'm holding my finger down. And then when I start one of these quick strokes where I want some paint, I just pull the trigger back very slightly. At the end of it, I push the trigger forward. I'm happy with the placement of some of these darker values, so I'm just going to come around again, darken them up. For this group of feathers along the right side, I'm going to start lightly drawing in the placement of them. You can see how I'm just kind of drawing in a bunch of thin lines here. It's almost like scribbling for this first layer. You can see that it adds just a very little bit of texture, but it also allows me to get the placement right because I'm not really able to remove this paint. So if I go lightly like this, I can adjust these shapes as I darken the paint with more layers later on. And just like the more advanced paintings, I always focus on one smaller section at a time. You can see here, I'm just focusing all of my attention on the head. I'm paying attention to the values, the lights and darks, and most importantly, the placement of them. Now, even though the erasability of this surface is not great at all, I can still come around and just lightly pull out some highlights. So moving down from here, for the outer contours on the lower part of this bird, I don't want to just paint an outline. So what I'm doing instead is just sketching in a few lines that radiate from the center of the bird out, and I'm just going to follow it along the lower part of this bird. And I'm making sure to leave some gaps, some spaces in between these lines so that it helps it look a little bit more like feathers. Now, something I want to point out here is that you probably noticed that my lines are looking very light. If you sprayed black paint before, you probably know that it gets very dark very quickly. And so that's one of the nice things about over-reduced paint, especially when you're working on a forgiving surface like paper, like I'm doing here. I can spray that paint in very thin layers and build the pigment up on that paper slowly. The more paint I add for this, the darker it's going to get. So what I want to do here is start painting in some of the outlines along the feather, along the top part of the bird. What I'm doing is following my pencil line drawing underneath and just painting thin lines right over the top. It's important to know that dark outlines around any part of a painting are always going to flatten the image. It's going to start making it look a little bit like a cartoon. So this is definitely not a technique that I'd be using in some of my other paintings, like the ones that I've shown on this channel. But for something like this, like a sketch, I think it looks nice. It kind of adds a bit of a style to it. The goal in the first part of this is just proportions and placement. I'm just trying to get everything in the correct place. Once I get most of these down, then I can start widening some of these lines and of course darkening them. And that's just done by adding more layers of paint on top. Once I have some more of these down, I will glaze a very light amount of this paint into the darker parts of the feathers. This way it just adds a very subtle gradient so it looks like light is shifting into dark. And of course, to bring out some light in a few of these areas, just some subtle erasing right over the top. As I paint in the body of the bird, I just want to give the impression that there's feathers in here, or the impression of textures. So the way that I'm doing that is in any of the shadow areas, I'm just painting a few lines parallel to one another. This is very similar to hatching in drawing. There's a ton of negative space in this sketch, meaning areas that don't have any paint. And so for a stylized sketch or an airbrush drawing like this, that negative space is actually very important because it makes it look like those are areas that are in highlight. And then for those patches of thinly painted lines, it just makes it look like those are some of the shadows. So what I'll do from here is slow the video back down to real time so you can see how I add in these shadows a little bit better. For this shadow underneath the wing, I'm painting in a few lines parallel to each other. Again, this is like hatching in drawing, but I'm doing it kind of messy here. I'm varying the width and I'm letting some of them overlap. And just a reminder, I'm always holding down on the trigger so that air is continually spraying. I'm just rocking the trigger backward and forward. When I want some paint for the start of each one of these strokes or lines, I just pull the trigger back a little bit, and then at the end, I push it forward again, but always keeping the air spraying the entire time. I only lift my trigger finger up when I stop painting. I'll move back to the eraser just to get some separation in between these lines, and then I'll darken up a few areas by adding some more paint. For these thin lines on the tail, I back the airbrush off the surface just a little bit more than I was doing before so I get some softer lines, and I just paint them all the way down. You'll see that as I'm doing this, I'm sketching in each one of these lines instead of painting a continuous one all the way down. I don't want this to look like a pinstriping line here. I want it to look like it's sketched in. So a bunch of small dashes as I work my way down to build up to one continuous line. And so now at this point, everything is in place for the bird. The proportions are set in. So I'm just going to make a pass over everything and just adjust a few things as needed. I'll darken up some of the values by glazing some paint on top and adding a few more lines painted in, and also using the eraser to help bring out some of the highlights a bit more. So to finish this one up, I'm just going to quickly sketch in the feet and the tree branch below it. The way I started it was painting in the outlines of the leg, just working my way down, and then just filling in a bit of a shadow along the right side. I did the same thing for each one of the feet, just a little bit of paint along the right side of each one. For the tree branch below it, I just sketched in the outlines and then just added a shadow, kind of some hatching strokes at the bottom there to make it look like that part of the branch is rounding away. Obviously not going for something like photorealism in this one, just adding an impression in there to make it look like there's a bit of depth to this branch. And for the right leg, I'm just loosely sketching it in. I didn't even finish it here. Sometimes for a simple painting like this, you don't need to go for everything. You could leave out some parts, people won't even notice. One final thing that I wanted to do was just help darken up the lower part of this branch, and I didn't want to get overspray on the background, so I'm using a shield here, lining it up with the lower part of it and spraying some paint up. Again, just a very light amount just to help round that part of the branch away. So that's it for this one. That's where I'm going to finish it up. Very simple little study, a sketch that you can do in about 20 minutes. I really hope that you enjoyed this one, just a simpler painting this week. If you'd like to see more like this, the easier stuff, just let me know. These are very quick to paint. They're also fun for me to do as well. I want to thank you all so much for being here. I hope that this little video was helpful, and I'll see you back here next Friday. And before I go, I want to say thank you so much to the very generous support of the channel members who really help keep this channel going. So thank you guys. I'd like to welcome the newest channel members this week. That's Suzanne D at a very generous tier 3, Steve D, Jeremy S, Reagan C, Aubrey W for resubscribing, and to Mehmet. Thank you guys all so much. Welcome back. Take care, everyone. Be well. I'll see you back here next Friday.